Captain Sarah Voss had negotiated treaties between mining cartels and asteroid belters, mediated disputes over terraforming rights that lasted 3 decades, and once talked a hive-mind species out of consuming an entire solar system because they found human classical music particularly crunchy. But standing in the docking bay of the Confluence asterisk, watching ships that seemed to fold space around themselves like origami made of starlight, she wondered if she'd finally met her match. "They're beautiful," whispered Lieutenant Torres from beside her, his voice carrying that particular blend of awe and terror reserved for first-contact situations. "They're 3 hours late," Sarah replied, though she had to admit the Ethani vessels were unlike anything in her 40 years of diplomatic service. The ships didn't so much land as settle into reality, their hulls shimmering with patterns that hurt to look at directly. The airlock cycled with a sound like distant wind chimes, and Sarah straightened her dress uniform for the 100th time. The door opened, and she found herself face to face with beings that could have stepped from humanity's most idealized dreams, if those dreams had been touched by starlight and refined by millennia of wisdom. Ambassador Lyrale emerged first, her movements carrying an impossible grace that made Sarah suddenly aware of every awkward human gesture she'd ever made. The alien woman, for she was unmistakably feminine despite the ethereal quality that seemed to emanate from her very presence, stood nearly as tall as Sarah, with silver hair that seemed to move in breezes that existed only around her. Her skin held a luminescence like moonlight on water, and her eyes were the color of deep space just before dawn on a clear world. But it was the ears that marked her as truly alien, long and gracefully pointed, tapering to tips that seemed to catch and reflect light in ways that defied optical physics. "Captain Voss," Lyrale said, her voice carrying harmonics that made Sarah's name sound like poetry. "We are honored to finally meet the mediator who convinced the Rigelian Trade Consortium to adopt workplace safety standards." Sarah blinked. "You know about that. Your reputation for impossible negotiations has reached even our distant worlds." Lyrale smiled, and Sarah realized with mild panic that the translator implant in her ear was rendering everything with a slight delay, meaning she'd been staring in silence for several seconds longer than diplomatic protocol suggested. "Welcome aboard the asterisk Confluence asterisk," Sarah managed, falling back on formal greeting procedures. "We are honored by your presence and hope these talks will." A sound like a freight train being strangled erupted from the ship's speakers, followed by the computer's cheerful announcement. "Emergency stations, all personnel to emergency stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, the lettuce is arriving in DOCKING Bay 7. Sarah felt heat rush to her face as she realized the universal translators were having what her chief engineer would technically call a catastrophic semantic breakdown, and what she would personally call the worst possible timing in the history of interspecies relations. Lyrale tilted her head, those magnificent ears twitching slightly. "I was not aware that produced shipments required such urgent military response protocols." "They don't," Sarah said weakly, frantically signaling to Torres to shut down the translator system. "Our computer seems to be having some difficulty with your language patterns." "Ah," Lyrale nodded sagely. "Your technology is attempting to process our harmonic subsystems as separate communication streams. We have encountered this before with species who communicate primarily through linear sound patterns." The computer chose that moment to announce, "Attention! The cosmic dairy has achieved sentience and demands representation in Galactic Senate Committee meetings." Sarah closed her eyes. In her 20 years of first contact protocols, she had never wanted the floor of a docking bay to simply open and deposit her into the cold vacuum of space more than she did right now. When she opened them, Lyrale was giggling. The sound was like silver bells caught in a gentle breeze, completely at odds with the dignified bearing Sarah had expected from a representative of an ancient starfaring civilization. The giggles escalated into full laughter, and soon Lyrale was covering her mouth with delicate fingers, her eyes sparkling with genuine mirth. "I apologize," she gasped between laughs, "but your computer just informed my delegation that we will be housed in the sacred chambers of the eternally rotating pastry wheel." Despite herself, Sarah felt her own mouth twitching. "I think it means the rotating habitat ring." "Yes, I rather hoped so, though now I am curious about your pastry technology." Lieutenant Torres, apparently deciding that dignity was already a casualty of this first contact, stepped forward. Ambassador, if I may ask, what did our computer announce to your people when you first arrived? Lyralay's expression grew even more amused. It welcomed us to your vessel with what it claimed was a traditional human greeting, then proceeded to, how do you say, belt out your emergency klaxons at maximum volume, while declaring that we would be processed for maximum flavor enhancement. Sarah's face went through several interesting color changes. It thought our emergency alarms were a greeting song. A very enthusiastic one, yes. We were quite impressed by your species' apparent commitment to acoustic hospitality. The absurdity of the situation finally broke through Sarah's diplomatic training, and she began to laugh. The sound echoed through the docking bay, joined by Tor's barely suppressed snickering and the continued mechanical announcements about the philosophical implications of interstellar vegetables. Perhaps, Lyralay suggested, wiping tears from her luminous eyes, we might conduct the formal introduction somewhere with less creative, technological assistance. As they moved through the corridors of the Confluence Asterisk, Sarah found herself stealing glances at her guest. The ship had been designed as a neutral meeting ground, its corridors wide enough to accommodate species with various mobility needs, its gravity adjustable, its atmosphere filterable for dozens of different respiratory systems. But watching Lyralay move through the spaces, she realized no engineer had quite anticipated the effect of someone who seemed to carry their own gravity field of elegance. They passed through the observation deck, where the vast windows showed the star field beyond, and Sarah noticed something odd. A small figure, clearly Ethani by the distinctive ear shape, was pressed against the far window, apparently studying the external sensor arrays with intense concentration. Is that? Sarah began. Lyralay followed her gaze and sighed, though the sound carried more affection than exasperation. My daughter, Zephyra, she was not supposed to be in this section of the ship. The child, for she was clearly young, despite the otherworldly poise that seemed to be an Ethani racial trait, turned at the sound of her name. Her ears, still growing into their adult proportions, gave her an appearance that was somehow both ancient and impossibly young. Her eyes, mirror images of her mother's stellar depth, fixed on Sarah with an intensity that was distinctly uncomfortable. Zephyra, Lyralay called in their musical language. You know you are meant to remain in the family quarters during diplomatic functions. The little girl tilted her head, studying Sarah with an expression that suggested she was cataloging details that would be significant later. Then, without a word, she padded over on silent feet, performed what appeared to be a formal bow that was somehow both childish and ceremonially perfect, and disappeared around a corner with the fluid motion of someone who had clearly been exploring the ship far longer than should have been possible. How long have you been aboard? Sarah asked. Approximately 47 minutes, Lyralay replied, then caught Sarah's expression. Ethani children are naturally curious about spatial relationships, and your security systems appear to find her presence conceptually challenging. Meaning she has already been in your engineering section, your communications array, and apparently spent several minutes in what your computer describes as the strategic pastry storage facility. Sarah made a mental note to have a very serious conversation with her chief of security, assuming she could convince him that a child had somehow bypassed systems designed to contain hostile alien entities and aggressive negotiations teams. They reached the main conference room, where the rest of both delegations waited with the kind of carefully maintained diplomatic composure that suggested everyone was aware that first contact was either going very well or very badly, but no one was quite sure which. As Sarah took her position at the head of the conference table, she caught a glimpse of movement in the ventilation grate above the room. Two large, curious eyes peered down at the proceeding. Lieutenant Commander Alex Rivera had spent 6 years learning 17 different alien languages, mastered the whistling complexities of Centaurian trade speak, and could even manage basic pleasantries in the geometric sound, patterns that the crystalline entities from Kepler 440 to be used for casual conversation. None of that had prepared him for a language that apparently existed in 4 dimensions simultaneously. Think of it as musical architecture, Ambassador Lyralay explained during their 3rd attempt at a basic lesson, her voice weaving harmonics that seemed to paint colors in the air around them. Each word carries not just meaning, but emotional resonance, temporal context, and what you might call intentional direction. Alex rubbed his temples, where a headache had taken up permanent residence somewhere around hour 14, of his latest marathon translation session. So when you say greeting, you're also saying, I acknowledge your worth. This moment has significance, and I hope for positive outcomes. And also, the starlight finds favor in your presence. But that is more of a cultural politeness embedded in the grammatical structure. Right, of course it is. Alex made another note in his increasingly incomprehensible study pad, and this is considered a simple exchange. Lyralay's laugh rippled through the linguistics lab like water over stones. Among children, yes. Adult conversation involves significantly more complexity. Alex stared at his notes, which now resembled the fevered scribblings of someone attempting to map quantum mechanics using interpretive dance notation. How do you ever manage to order breakfast? We don't, typically. Nutrition is provided through atmospheric absorption and solar synthesis. Though I understand your people have made remarkable advances in the art of coffee, which our preliminary cultural analysis suggests serves multiple social and biochemical functions simultaneously. Coffee is essential to human civilization, Alex agreed solemnly. Without it, we probably would have never made it past the Bronze Age. This explains much about your species' development patterns. Lyralay nodded with equal gravity. We have been puzzled by your tendency to schedule crucial meetings before your solar cycle reaches optimal brightness. Alex was about to explain the concept of morning meetings when the lab's computer chimed with an incoming linguistic analysis. The screen filled with what appeared to be a three-dimensional graph having an argument with a musical score, while the speakers emitted a sound like confused dolphins attempting opera. Translation attempt number 47, the computer announced cheerfully. Ethani phrase analyzed as, the cosmic vegetables have achieved enlightenment and request immediate diplomatic immunity. Alex and Lyralay stared at the screen in silence. I said, good morning, how did you sleep? Lyralay offered helpfully. I gathered that from context, Alex sighed, making a note to recalibrate the entire translation matrix. Again, though I have to admit, I'm starting to understand why your daughter keeps showing up everywhere. If this is how our technology interprets simple conversation, I can't imagine what it makes of whatever she's trying to communicate. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Zephyra materialized in the doorway of the lab. Alex had given up trying to figure out how she managed to appear in restricted areas with the casual ease of someone who considered locked doors merely decorative. The ship's security chief had developed a nervous tic whenever her name was mentioned. Zephyra, Lyralay said in their liquid language, you know you should announce yourself before entering workspaces. The little girl tilted her head, studying Alex with those unsettling eyes that seemed far too knowing for someone who couldn't be more than 7 or 8 years old, assuming Ethani children aged anything like human ones. She said something in rapid, musical bursts that made the translation computer emit a sound like a mechanical cat coughing up a hairball made of pure confusion. She says, Lyralay translated, that your learning patterns are interestingly chaotic and that your mind makes colorful shapes when you're frustrated. Alex blinked. She can see my thoughts. Not precisely. Ethani children are naturally empathic until they learn to control the ability in adolescence. She's responding to your emotional resonance patterns. Translation, she can tell when I'm losing my mind over verb conjugations. More or less, yes. Zephyra padded closer, apparently fascinated by Alex's study notes. She pointed at a particularly elaborate diagram he'd drawn trying to map Ethani temporal linguistic structures and asked what sounded like a question. She wants to know why you draw time as circles when your species experiences it as arrows, Lyralay interpreted. Alex looked down at his notes, then at the child who was somehow asking philosophical questions about the nature of temporal perception. Because that's how I'm trying to understand how you talk about past and future events in the same sentence. Zephyra considered this, then picked up Alex's stylus and added a few marks to his diagram. Suddenly, the incomprehensible mess of arrows and circles resolved into something that actually made sense, not as a linear progression or a cyclical pattern, but as a spiral that allowed for multiple temporal perspectives to exist simultaneously. Alex stared at the corrected diagram. That's actually brilliant. The little girl beamed at him with the pure joy of someone who had successfully explained something obvious to a slow adult, then asked another question that sent the translator into what sounded like mechanical hysterics. She wants to know if humans always work so hard to make simple things complicated, Lyreley said, her voice carrying barely suppressed amusement. It's a species trait, Alex admitted. We're very good at overthinking. Zephyra nodded seriously, as if this confirmed something she had suspected, then wandered over to examine the linguistic analysis equipment. Within moments, she had somehow activated 3 different diagnostic programs simultaneously and appeared to be conducting her own analysis of human communication patterns. Should I be worried that she's now running unauthorized experiments on our translation software? Alex asked. Probably not, Lyreley replied, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely certain. Ethani children learn through direct interaction with systems. It's how we developed our technology, by allowing the young to play with concepts until they achieve understanding. And if she breaks something, then you will learn something new about system limitations. Alex watched Zephyra manipulate the translation interface with casual expertise, her small fingers dancing over controls that had taken him weeks to master. The computer, rather than producing its usual garbled interpretations, began generating what appeared to be actual coherent analysis of Ethani linguistic patterns. How is she doing that? She's not trying to force your technology to work like ours, Lyreley observed. She's teaching it to find the patterns that already exist within its own capabilities. Within minutes, Zephyra had the system producing translations that, while not perfect, were at least comprehensible. She turned to Alex with an expression of polite curiosity and said something that the computer now rendered as, "Why do your people make promises they cannot keep?" Alex felt something cold settle in his stomach. "I'm sorry." "It's a reasonable question," Lyreley said gently. "She's analyzing human communication patterns and noting inconsistencies between stated intentions and probable outcomes. She's analyzing our entire species." "Children see clearly," Lyreley replied, which Alex suspected was both an answer and an evasion. Zephyra asked another question, this one translated as, "Do you choose to be afraid or does fear choose you?" Alex stared at the child, who was apparently conducting her own psychological assessment of humanity while casually debugging alien technology. That's a very complex question." Zephyra nodded seriously, made a note on a device Alex hadn't seen her pick up, and asked a third question that the computer struggled with before finally offering. "When you try to be better than you are, do you become less than you were?" The silence that followed felt heavy with implications Alex didn't understand. Lyreley was watching her daughter with an expression he couldn't read, while Zephyra continued to study him with the focused attention of someone conducting an experiment with significant consequences. "Am I being tested?" Alex asked quietly. "We are all being tested," Lyreley replied. "The question is whether we understand what we're being tested for." Zephyra apparently finished whatever evaluation she was conducting, because she suddenly smiled, an expression of pure, childlike warmth that made Alex forget, momentarily, how unsettling her questions had been. She said something that sounded like a blessing, handed him back his stylus, and padded out of the lab with the same mysterious efficiency with which she had arrived. "What did she just say?" Alex asked. Lyreley was quiet for a long moment, watching her daughter disappear around the corner. "She said you have interesting answers to questions you don't know you're asking." Alex looked down at his notes, which somehow seemed more comprehensible now, as if seeing them through alien eyes had revealed patterns he'd been missing. "Ambassador, what exactly is happening here?" Because a musical instrument, designed by someone who had never actually heard music, but had received a very enthusiastic description from a tone-deaf friend. Captain Voss stood at the entrance, watching her engineering team make increasingly frantic adjustments to the acoustic dampeners, while Ambassador Lyreley offered suggestions that were undoubtedly helpful but translated into things like, perhaps the sound-catching geometric flowers need more philosophical alignment with the cosmic harmony nodes. "How exactly?" Chief Engineer Martinez called from somewhere inside what appeared to be a three-dimensional spiderweb of resonance chambers. "Am I supposed to calibrate equipment for beings who communicate in mathematical poetry?" "Very carefully," Sarah suggested, which earned her a look that could have melted titanium. The ceremony of resonance, as Lyreley had finally explained, was something between a diplomatic ratification and a cosmic job interview. 12 species in recorded galactic history had been invited to participate. 11 had been accepted into what Alex now called the Galactic Garden Club of Advanced Civilizations. The 12th had simply stopped being significant, fading from interstellar affairs as if they had never quite managed to matter. "No pressure," Sarah muttered, watching Martinez attempt to explain to the ship's computer why they needed to reconfigure the artificial gravity generators to create zones of intentional weightlessness for contemplative floating. The computer, still struggling with Ethani linguistic concepts, had interpreted this as a request to establish regions of aggressive buoyancy for hostile meditation purposes, and was now asking whether it should prepare defensive countermeasures against potentially weaponized inner peace. Alex emerged from behind a bank of harmonic resonance equipment, his hair sticking up in directions that suggested either scientific breakthrough or complete mental breakdown. "I think I've figured out the basic acoustic requirements," he announced. "The good news is we can make it work. The bad news is that anyone who tries to speak normally in there will sound like they've been inhaling helium while gargling with liquid nitrogen." "Demonstrate," Sarah ordered, because sometimes leadership meant embracing inevitable embarrassment. Alex stepped into the chamber and said, in what was presumably his normal voice, testing the acoustic modifications for ceremonial compatibility. What came out sounded like a chipmunk attempting to recite Shakespeare while falling down a very melodious well. The effect was so ridiculous that even Lyreley, who had been maintaining diplomatic composure throughout the morning's chaos, began giggling again. "Perhaps," she managed between laughs, "we should warn the Ethani delegation that human vocal cords will require adjustment to the ceremonial environment. How do your people manage normal conversation in there?" Alex asked, his squeaky voice making the question sound like a cartoon character inquiring about quantum physics. "We don't use vocal cords for formal ceremonies," Lyreley explained. "Communication occurs through harmonic resonance, channeled directly through neural interfaces." Sarah felt a familiar sinking sensation. "And humans don't have neural interfaces." "Not compatible ones, no. So we're going to conduct the most important diplomatic ceremony in human history, sounding like a delegation of helium-addicted mice." "It could be worse," Martinez called from inside the resonance web. "The gravity fluctuations mean you'll also be randomly floating at unpredictable intervals." As if to demonstrate, Alex suddenly drifted toward the ceiling, his arms windmilling frantically. "The ceremonial protocols didn't mention anything about aerial diplomacy. Ethani naturally adjust to variable gravity fields," Lyreley said apologetically. "We assumed all spacefaring species would have developed similar adaptations. We developed artificial gravity so we wouldn't have to," Sarah replied, watching Alex attempt to negotiate his way back to the floor using a combination of swimming motions and sheer determination. "Most of our spatial orientation skills involve knowing which way is down and staying there." The morning continued in a series of increasingly creative disasters. The ceremonial robes, delivered by an Ethani cultural attaché who seemed genuinely baffled by human body proportions, turned out to be designed for beings with longer torsos, additional joint articulations, and apparently no need for things like sleeves that ended anywhere near where arms actually terminated. Sarah found herself draped in what appeared to be an extremely elegant tent made of fabric that shifted color in response to emotional states. Currently, it was cycling through various shades of frustrated crimson and bewildered orange, with occasional flashes of what she suspected was diplomatic panic yellow. "The ceremonial significance of the robes," the cultural attaché explained through the translation system, "lies in their ability to reflect the inner harmony of the wearer through chromatic resonance patterns." Sarah looked down at her robe, which was now displaying what could only be described as agitated plaid. "What does this pattern mean?" "It suggests you are experiencing complex emotional states with multiple overlapping concerns, and possibly some digestive uncertainty." "That's disturbingly accurate." Alex, meanwhile, had discovered that his robe responded to the helium voice effect by producing colors that didn't seem to exist in normal space. When he spoke, the fabric displayed hues that made everyone's eyes water slightly. "I think I'm generating impossible colors," he announced, his squeaky voice causing his robe to flash what appeared to be the visual equivalent of a migraine. "It's the harmonic resonance interacting with the chromatic fibers," Lyreley explained, though she was watching the display with fascination rather than concern. Your vocal patterns are creating frequencies that translate into wavelengths outside the normal visible spectrum. So I'm wearing a robe that can see sounds that don't exist. More or less, yes. The final insult came with the ceremonial offering preparation. The crystallized intention that each species was required to present turned out to be the result of a 36-hour meditation and fasting period, during which participants were supposed to achieve a state of perfect mental clarity and cosmic awareness. No one had mentioned the fasting requirement until that morning. 36 hours? Sarah's stomach chose that moment to produce a rumble that echoed through the ceremonial chamber like distant thunder. The ceremony is in 12 hours. It is problematic, Lyreley admitted. The crystallized intention requires a completely clear physical and mental state to achieve proper resonance. Another rumble from Sarah's digestive system, this one answered by sympathetic growls from Alex and Martinez, who had also missed breakfast while working on the chamber modifications. Perhaps, Sarah suggested hopefully, we could explain that human digestive cycles operate on different temporal requirements. The cosmic significance of the offering depends on the purity of the meditative state, the cultural attaché replied. Biological functions create interference patterns in the crystallization process. Sarah's robe was now displaying what appeared to be hungry desperation blue, with undertones of diplomatic crisis silver. She was about to suggest that humanity might need to reschedule its entire cosmic destiny around breakfast when a small figure appeared in the chamber entrance. Zephyra surveyed the scene with the calm assessment of someone who had anticipated exactly this level of chaos. She said something to her mother in rapid Ethani that made Lyreley's eyes widen. What did she say? Sarah asked. She says the ceremony is not about following the rules perfectly, Lyreley translated, her voice carrying a note of surprise. She says it's about how you handle it when the rules don't work. The little girl padded into the chamber, apparently unaffected by the gravity fluctuations, and walked directly to Alex, who was currently floating upside down near the ceiling, his robe cycling through impossible colors while he tried to figure out how to return to the floor with dignity. Zephyra looked up at him and asked something that the translation system rendered as, "When everything goes wrong, do you laugh or do you hide?" Alex, hanging in midair in a robe that was apparently displaying the visual representation of bewildered determination, started laughing. The sound, filtered through the helium effect, came out as a sound like joy being processed through a very small and enthusiastic music box. Zephyra nodded seriously, as if this confirmed something important, then turned to her mother and spoke in the liquid tones of formal Ethani. Whatever she said made Lyreley look first surprised, then thoughtful, then something that might have been pleased. "What's she saying now?" Sarah asked. Lyreley was quiet for a long moment, studying her daughter with an expression of growing wonder. "She's saying that perhaps the ceremony should be tomorrow, when we can all learn from watching humans be authentically human. Meaning she wants to see how your species handles impossible situations with grace, humor, and stubborn determination, to make things work despite everything going wrong." Sarah looked around the chamber, where Martinez was still wrestling with acoustic equipment that insisted on translating everything into philosophical concepts. Alex was slowly rotating near the ceiling in a robe that was displaying colors that shouldn't exist, and she herself was draped in fabric that was currently advertising her emotional state to anyone within visual range. "She wants to see us fail creatively. She wants to see you succeed in ways we never considered," Lyreley corrected. "The Ethani have spent so long perfecting our ceremonies that we've forgotten what it looks like when someone approaches the impossible with enthusiastic improvisation." Zephyra nodded again, then said something else that made her mother smile with what looked suspiciously like pride. "She says humans are the first species to make the preparation more interesting than the actual ceremony," Lyreley translated, "and that anyone who can maintain this much good humor while everything goes wrong probably has something to teach the galaxy about resilience." Sarah felt her robe shift to what she hoped was a more optimistic color. "So we're being judged on our ability to handle disaster with dignity. You're being judged on your ability to handle disaster with creativity, humor, and the kind of stubborn optimism that keeps trying to make things work even when logic suggests giving up." From his position near the ceiling, Alex's voice drifted down. In that case, the ceremonial chamber hummed with energies that made Alex's teeth ache in harmonically pleasing ways. 24 hours of emergency preparation had transformed the space into something that functioned, if not elegantly, then at least without actively trying to kill anyone. The gravity fluctuations had been tamed to what Martinez cheerfully described as only mildly nauseating, and the acoustic modifications now produced voices that sounded merely like someone speaking while breathing helium instead of like cartoon characters attempting to discuss quantum mechanics. Alex stood in the center of the chamber, draped in ceremonial robes that had finally settled on a color scheme he privately thought of as nervous but determined blue, with accents of trying really hard gold. Around him, representatives from both species arranged themselves according to protocols that had been hastily revised, when it became clear that humans couldn't maintain the traditional positions without either floating away or falling over. Captain Voss occupied what was nominally the human leadership position, though her robe's current display of controlled panic rainbow suggested she was still adjusting to the reality of conducting diplomacy while dressed like a walking mood ring. The Ethani delegation formed elegant geometric patterns that probably had deep spiritual significance, though Alex suspected they were also practical arrangements designed to keep everyone within range of the harmonic resonance field. Ambassador Lyrale stood at what appeared to be a focal point of the ceremonial space. Her own robes shifting through colors that existed in spectrums Alex was fairly certain human eyes weren't supposed to be able to process. But it was Zephyra who drew his attention, sitting quietly beside her mother in a position that the protocols designated for honored observers, but which Alex increasingly suspected might be the most important spot in the room. The ceremony of resonance begins with the offering of crystallized intention, Lyrale announced, her voice weaving through the chamber's harmonics in ways that made the words feel like they were arriving from several directions simultaneously. Each species presents the distilled essence of their hopes for this alliance. The Ethani offering materialized in the center of the chamber, a structure of light and sound that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the room technically contained. It pulsed with patterns that suggested vast patience, cosmic wisdom, and something that might have been loneliness, the isolation of a species that had grown so advanced they had difficulty connecting with younger civilizations. The human offering, Voss announced, stepping forward with the careful dignity of someone trying not to trip over ceremonial robes while floating in variable gravity. What humanity presented was decidedly less cosmic in scope. Martinez had managed to crystallize their intentions using a modified holographic matrix that produced something resembling a three-dimensional kaleidoscope made of coffee steam, stubborn determination, and what the scanner had registered as aggressive optimism. It wasn't elegant, but it pulsed with an energy that seemed to bounce around the chamber with infectious enthusiasm. "Interesting," Lyrale murmured, and Alex caught the hint of a smile in her voice. "Your offering appears to be mobile." The crystallized human intention had indeed begun moving around the chamber, investigating the Ethani offering with the curiosity of a friendly dog meeting a particularly dignified cat. When the two constructs touched, they produced a harmonic resonance that sounded like laughter translated into mathematics. "And now," Lyrale continued, "we proceed to the soul reading, where the essence of humanity will be examined through its chosen representative." Alex felt the attention of the room focus on him with almost physical weight. The Ethani empaths began their approach, moving in patterns that seemed choreographed by someone who understood the dance of planetary orbits. As they reached out with senses he didn't possess to touch thoughts he wasn't sure he wanted to share, Alex found himself thinking about the past few days. He thought about translation failures that became moments of unexpected connection, about a little girl who asked impossible questions with the casual curiosity of someone who hadn't yet learned that some things were supposed to be difficult. He thought about his species' talent for making everything more complicated than necessary, and their equal talent for finding ways to make things work anyway. The empathic touch felt like starlight against his consciousness, revealing layers of human experience he hadn't realized he was carrying. Through alien perception, he saw his own people, flawed, chaotic, driven by emotions they didn't always understand, making mistakes with enthusiasm and trying to fix them with stubborn creativity. But he also saw something else: humanity's peculiar gift for caring about outcomes they couldn't control, for trying to do right even when right was unclear, for loving imperfectly but completely. It was messy and inefficient and frequently ridiculous, but it was also something the galaxy apparently needed. The soul reading deepened, and Alex felt his individual consciousness becoming a window into the broader human experience. The empath saw through him to his entire species. Their wars and art, their scientific breakthroughs and spectacular failures, their capacity for both breathtaking cruelty and impossible kindness, often within the same individual. And through it all, threading like a golden wire through the tapestry of human nature, was something the Ethani had lost in their ascension to cosmic wisdom. The ability to be surprised by joy, to find hope in hopeless situations, to laugh at themselves while refusing to give up. The chamber fell into profound silence as the soul reading reached its conclusion. Alex felt the empathic touch withdraw, leaving him oddly bereft, as if he had been briefly connected to something vast and had to return to the confines of his individual mind. The Ethani empaths conferred in harmonics too subtle for the translation system to process. Their discussion seemed to go on forever, though Alex's chronometer insisted only minutes had passed. He could feel the weight of decision building in the chamber, the sense that the next words spoken would alter the trajectory of human civilization. Then Zephyra stood up. The movement should have been insignificant, a child shifting position during a lengthy ceremony. Instead, it sent ripples of attention through the assembled dignitaries. Protocol demanded that she remain seated and silent during the formal evaluation process. But Zephyra had apparently decided that protocol was less important than whatever had captured her attention. She walked into the center of the ceremonial space with the fearless curiosity that had characterized all their previous encounters. Alex found himself holding his breath as she approached, those ancient eyes in a child's face, studying him with an intensity that suggested she was seeing something the formal evaluation had missed. The chamber held its collective breath as she stopped directly in front of him. Alex knelt, bringing himself to her eye level, though he suspected that in terms of actual perception, she was looking down at him from heights he couldn't imagine. Zephyra tilted her head, considering him with the same focused attention she had brought to studying the ship systems, analyzing human communication patterns, and asking questions that revealed uncomfortable truths about his species' nature. But now there was something different in her expression, not the scientific curiosity of previous encounters, but something that might have been recognition. She reached out with one small hand and touched his forehead, and for a moment Alex felt the echo of what the empaths had experienced, saw himself and his species through eyes that had no preconceptions about what humanity should be, only acceptance of what they were. Then Zephyra stepped back, turned to her mother, and spoke in the clear, ringing tones of someone making an announcement of cosmic significance. "Mom, that's the one." The silence that followed was so complete that Alex wondered if time itself had paused to consider the implications. Every being in the chamber seemed frozen, processing the weight of what had just occurred. A child had just overridden millennia of formal evaluation protocols with the simple authority of innocent recognition. Ambassador Lyralay's expressions cycled through surprise, understanding, and something that looked very much like maternal pride. The other Ethani representatives seemed to be having rapid discussions in harmonics too subtle for translation, but their body language suggested that a fundamental shift had just occurred in the ceremony's trajectory. "The innocent eye," Lyralay said finally, her voice carrying wonder and something that might have been relief. "In all our recorded ceremonies, this has never happened. The children are always silent observers, learning from the process but never participating." "What does it mean?" Captain Voss asked, her robe now cycling through colors that suggested she was afraid to hope. "It means," Lyralay smiled, "that my daughter has just bypassed thousands of years of formal evaluation protocols and made the choice that adults were struggling to reach through careful deliberation." Zephyra nodded seriously, as if confirming that this had indeed been her intention, then added something in rapid Ethani that made her mother laugh. "She says the formal evaluation was taking too long, and that sometimes the most important truths are obvious to anyone who looks without trying to be clever." Alex found his voice, though it came out somewhat squeaky due to the chamber's acoustic properties. "What exactly has she chosen?" "You," Lyralay said simply, "not as a representative of humanity, but as humanity itself. She sees in you what makes your species worth preserving. The ability to care about things beyond yourselves, to keep trying even when success seems impossible, to find humor in the darkest situations, and to love imperfectly but completely." "But I'm not, I'm just—" "You're human," Zephyra said in clear, unaccented English, speaking directly for the first time since they had met. And being human is enough. The translation system, apparently as surprised as everyone else, remained mercifully silent. Alex realized that something fundamental had shifted, not just in the ceremony, but in his understanding of what humanity brought to the galaxy. They weren't being accepted despite their flaws, but because of them. Because their chaos and creativity, their stubborn hope and ridiculous optimism, were exactly what the cosmic community